Everything that happens in business is ultimately wrapped up in one conversation or another. It seems a bit wise and prudent to spend a bit more time thinking about the kinds of conversations that we have.
It seemed like conversations are the one thing we share as humans. It's everywhere, and it's a lifelong practice. I grew up with that voice inside, I'm not a big enough man. And it wasn't until I studied language and started doing my own investigations into his story that I was able to bust it. The bigger the gap between what's going on with the committee, the more stress we live in. The metaphor I like is going from holding our judgments with a fist versus holding it with an open hand. When you open your hand and say, here's my concerns, here are my standards, I'm curious about yours, that is.
There is no growth in comfort and no comfort in growth. Yet the big leaps are how careers are made and how businesses excel. So how do you master not knowing at all or feeling like an imposter? How do you have the conversations that lead to trust and, of course, excellence? How do you take charge of the things that you can control? How do you thrive outside your comfort zone? That's what this podcast is about. I'm your host, Wanda Wallace, and it's time to get out of your comfort zone. Welcome to the conversation. So, everything I believe, and if you look at my website, you know I say this pretty prolifically, that everything that happens in business is ultimately wrapped up in one conversation or another in various different forms. Therefore, it seems a bit wise and prudent, in my opinion, to spend a bit more time thinking about the kinds of conversations that we have, our role in moving those conversations forward or perhaps backwards, and what we can do to actually improve some of the conversations that we're having. So that is the focus for today. We're going to be talking about conscious conversations. So my guest is Chuck Wisner. He spent 30 years as a trusted advisor, coach, and teacher in communication, human dynamics, and leadership excellence, all working with leaders and their teams in Fortune 200 companies. He's trained in mediation, and he works as a senior mediator affiliated with the Harvard Mediation Program at Harvard Law School. He's also been affiliated with MIT's Center for Organizational Learning. And more importantly for today, his book is The Art of Conscious Conversations, Transforming How We Talk, Listen, and Interact. Chuck's website is chuckwisner, WISNER.com if you want to know more. And Chuck, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. I'm looking forward to this one. I always start with why. Why this topic? Why does it matter to you enough to write a book about it?
Well, a short of a long story, I've been curious about relationships and families and communication for a long time. I came from a fairly dysfunctional family, and in some ways, I was a mediator as a young child, so separating battles and things, and and then I studied architecture, and in architecture, we had a partner at one point that was an alcoholic, and we didn't know what to do. Um, and I saw lots of conflict in architecture too. I mean, just smart people fighting all the time. But we didn't know what to do, so we hired some help. And then a woman we hired, Linda Reed, came in and worked with us individually and as a group. And we came the other end. We all came out the other end better and wiser and happier. And what she did felt like magic to me. And so I just was so curious. I just looked into it and kept studying and ended up studying the ontology of language and mediation because it seemed like conversations are the one thing we share as humans, no matter what language, no matter what culture, to be together, have fun together, and work together. So it's crucial, and it changed my life. My studies changed my life as a father of my professional life as well. So it's everywhere, and it's a lifelong practice.
It's a lifeline, there's no question. Chuck, we should do a survey someday of the number of people who are coaches or trainers or facilitators in this work around conversations and human interactions and so on, and how many of us started out life in a dysfunctional family that sort of fueled our desire to know more. I suspect it's a lot of us. So, okay. All right, you talk about, I'll leave that right there. That's enough to be left alone. All right,
Yeah,
you talk about, you talk about 4 types of conversations. Explain the 4.
So there's 4 types. they obviously we weave in and out of these four types, but the way that my book is structured, it's imperative to sort of think about them sequentially, because the first one is storytelling, and that is very much foundational, because we live life through stories. There's a great quote that the world isn't made of atoms, it's made of stories. Um, and and so we live in stories, and it's a lovely thing, and we entertain ourselves and we have fun. But then it's also the other side of that coin is that we tell stories about ourselves and about other people that aren't helpful, that are harmful. And so what we need to do is become aware of the stories that we live in and the stories we live through, because then that helps us navigate the next conversation, which is collaboration, which is our art of dancing, advocating and inquiring, asking and telling and learning from each other, and being open to other ideas. The more we do our own work and can investigate our stories, the more we don't hold them tightly with a fist, but the more we can hold them open-handedly. And then that conversation, collaboration, when we have a beautiful collaborative conversation, my mind might change. We might think of ideas that we never thought of before. And that's when the creative conversation comes in. And that is our ability to sort of trust our intuition, develop our right brain as much as we work on our left brain, our intuitive self. And it's also the trusting ourselves to wonder, to dream about possibilities, because that step of just giving ourselves permission to go, what's possible? How many possibilities are there? And if we can do that well, if we can do all those well, then the last conversation is commitment conversations, which is really the action conversation. It's how we coordinate action with other people, how we get stuff done. And it's everywhere. It's at home, whether who's doing the dishes, who's picking up the kids, to the board meeting of what strategy are we going to adopt and agree to for the next year. So commitment conversations are everywhere, and we tend to do them fairly quickly and fairly sloppily.
Yeah.
So to learn
Um,
all four helps us navigate multiple
right. Right.
domains.
I can see how
Yeah.
those build forward because I think it's so easy in business to rush to the commitment conversation and to miss the collaborative conversation and the creative conversation. And I totally agree with you. Until we're aware of the stories we are telling ourselves, then we are not aware of what we're
Hmm.
thinking, what our intuition is, how we're getting in our own way, and a host of other things. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's start with this story conversation. Can you give me an example of what one of these looks like? Why it's so important?
Yeah. So from a personal standpoint, Um, I grew up with a very redneck grandfather, adopted grandfather. I'm not adopted, step grandfather. And I don't have to define what that means. Uh, and and I had three older sisters, but when I cried, or when I didn't want to skin the deer, or I didn't want to kill the rabbit, I was always told I wasn't being a big enough man.
Hmm.
So at a young age, I kept getting that message. If I got upset, if I cried, if I did anything, be a bigger man, be a big enough man. You're not a big enough man. Stop being a sissy. Well, as my authority figures, I adopted their voice. I adopted their opinion. And literally, I grew up with that voice inside. I'm not a big enough man. And it wasn't until I studied language and I started doing my stories and started doing my own investigations into his story that I was able to bust it. So that lived with me for 30 years,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
until I was able to say, wait a minute, that was his story. That's not true. The facts don't line up. I don't have to adopt that opinion. And I had plenty of evidence that I was doing quite well in the world,
Right.
and was the man I needed to be.
Right. I see
Yeah.
the stories we tell ourselves playing out big script and little script all over my clients' lives. I'm going to give you two examples and you can comment on whether these fit in what you mean or not. One example is a leader who says, I have this idealized image of what my senior leader should do for me. And it's based on an early experience I had in school with a sports coach and how that sports coach really nurtured and grew and matured me without even stopping to say, does that even make sense? Is that even a reasonable expectation? And furthermore, not even articulating, therefore, what it is was unique about that and what I'm hoping from you as my senior leader, or what I'm trying to do for my junior team and whether that's what they want or not. So we have some stories that are hidden, but we also have stories that we tell vocally all the time to our friends. So somebody did something and I think that was the wrong thing to do. And I'm going to tell all my friends and family, my coworker
Yeah.
is an idiot or is trying to
Idiot.
sabotage
Yeah.
me or is jealous of me or is whatever. And we spin a whole story around that to make our opinion sound right. We miss a few other
Hmm.
details, though, however.
Yes.
So those are the stories I think about. Are those the same ones you're seeing?
Yeah. Yeah. And the first one is, the first one about the coach. Um, there's some value in that, but unless that person investigates what's good about it, what inspired me,
Mhm.
what helped me, right? So there's that piece to really ground yourself and why is that important. And the other piece is we can have a story about our coach and then project it onto our boss, which we have zero
Right,
control over. So
right.
we could like really be angry, really be upset for months or years, like saying this boss doesn't do what I want him to do, when in fact it's none of our business. If you really believe in this kind of leadership, and you are resigned to being with this person that you don't think is giving you what you need, that's your problem. You need to do something about it. You need to remove yourself, or you need to do your work and say, okay, how can I resolve this with this particular leader? Yeah. And the second one is total toxicity. The rumors and the stories we tell as people, we're just spreading toxins around, which doesn't do anybody any good.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah, I find in the first
Yeah.
case with a person who has the coach idealized image of what a leader should do. Their leader may be able to do it, may be willing to do it, and may not be able or may not be willing. But if we don't at least start with a conscious understanding and a conversation about here's what I'd like to have from you, we don't know if it's possible
Yeah.
or not. So we leave everybody
That's right.
confused.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so you talk about four questions that we need to ask ourselves. So, first off, why do we need to ask ourselves questions and what are those questions?
Okay. So in the examples that we just talked about, um, these four questions are what I've learned and developed as a shortcut. It's like a cheat sheet for investigating our own judgments, and also learning to inquire about other people, how they're thinking, because they might come to us with a judgment, and we can react and we can have an emotional reaction. But if we use these four questions, we can ask them, because tell me more. I'd like to understand why you think that way, right? And so the metaphor I like is the four questions. It's going from holding our judgments with a fist versus holding it with an open hand, holding our opinion with a fist versus holding it with an open hand. And by open hand, I mean if I have a fist and say, no, this is how we should do it, Wanda. I know this is right. This is exactly how we're going to do it. We could get in a defensive routine together, right? But if I go, let me tell you why I think this, why I think this so important. My goal here is to achieve this. This is my desire. That's the first one of the four questions. What do I really want? And if I say to you, my goal is to get this project on track and get it moving, you might agree, you might not agree, but now that's on the table. The second one is I have concerns. I have concerns if we don't change our process, we're not going to meet our deadline. And here's what I mean by our process. And do we agree on the deadline? That's our concerns. That's the second question. The third question, what are the power issues at play? There's always authority issues in every conversation, even with a friend. Some friends' voices we give power to, some friends' voices we just brush off, right? Take that into business, and we're in hierarchies, right? There's artificial power, right? That's given by the status of where you are in the organization. And so there's always power issues. And to be aware of that really can dramatically change how you approach a conversation. Um, and then the last one is standards. And this is huge because every one of our judgments and opinions has underneath standards that we believe in that are part of our belief system of what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, what's successful and what's not. So that underbelly of our standards is really great to surface because often we can be in arguments or in defensiveness when in fact we just say, well, I'm judging this from here and the other person is judging it from there, from another place. And so those four questions really help us deconstruct things.
Right. So the four questions, just to be sure: what do I want? What's my goal? What's my desire? What are my concerns? I have concerns. What do I want to say about it? What are the power issues that are at play, whether they're formal hierarchical powers or informal status powers? They come in all many different shapes. And what are the standards? And I might add to that my own values, because I often find, as many people have described, Jennifer Goldman Wetzler in particular, the conflict is often around the values or the importance of one value versus another. So we'll make a decision or a recommendation or an opinion based on my three values, 1, 2, 3. You may have the same values. That's just have to be as in 3, 2, 1. So order. So we would come to different conclusions. So goal,
Yeah. So
concerns, power,
Wanda, that's a
standards.
great, yeah. Standard. And Wanda, that's a great point about values because for me, that comes under the bucket of standards. How do I think about my morals, my life, how I want to live my life, what values I hold? So it's in that bucket. But and those four things, if you can just it's hard to stick, but if put it on a sticky note and put it on your desk if you have a tough conversation. Ask yourself those questions and then ask really good questions to other people to understand their thinking.
Okay.
So it really is a little cheat sheet.
All right, so let's go back to, I don't know which one you want to do, whether there's a more toxic environment or whether somebody has their own expectations about how they should be led. Which one you want to do? I want to walk through what the
Well, the
conversation would look
toxic
like.
one, sure. They're so different. The one is a professional, and one is personal. Um, the, the toxic one is often harder to get at, you know. So we could do that one.
Okay, let's do that one. And the let's say that it's a peer. And let's say I don't like the order in which the peer is getting their work done or the standards that they're using to get it done, the timeliness, and it's impacting my work because I'm dependent on them in some way. Okay. And I'm going to have an opinion about that peer that they don't have the same level of commitment to quality that I have. Just make that as a
Hmm.
judgment. Okay.
Okay.
So now, where do I start? Let's just say it's me that's in this role, and I really don't like this peer, and they've done this to me before, and they've sabotaged me, and maybe have some other things about they really want to see me fail, or who knows, whatever. Where do I start now in that scenario with your four questions? Do I start with what's my goal, or
Okay.
do I
So we
start
would
with what's their goal?
no, you start with you. We
Okay.
always start at home,
Okay.
right?
Good. Uh-huh.
And before we get to the four questions, and I talk about this in the book, we can ground the conversation in facts. Like when you say she's not doing her things, then I might say to you, so what facts do you have to back that up? I mean, literally that she could not disagree with. You say, what are there facts that she couldn't disagree with, or he couldn't disagree with? Um, so that's really important, and because it's tricky because our ears don't make a distinction between facts and opinions.
Uh-huh.
So we hear an opinion and we say, "Oh, the fact is she doesn't do good work." Well, that's not a fact. That's my opinion. So then I'd say, "Well, do you have a fact about that?" Right. So that's really an important question.
Okay, and let me
And
stay
then the
with that one
next
for
one,
hold on, hold on. Let me stay with that for a minute because what I hear all the time is people will say, "Well, I know it's a fact because other people tell me they have the same experience." And my response as a coach to that always is, of course, people would tell you that because they're telling you opinions that are consistent with your opinion. They're not telling you data that's inconsistent with your opinion. So you have to be careful about using other people's gossip, if you will, as a fact.
absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. And that again, we are not trained well to make that distinction.
Right. Okay. So let's say I have a few facts. My peer doesn't deliver on time as promised. Let's say that's one of the facts that we would
Okay.
both agree on. Okay.
Okay, great.
What's next in the
And then
conversation?
and then what emotion is that triggering for you?
Anger, anxiety. I'm angry at my peer for not getting the work done, for promising and not doing it. And I'm anxious because I'm afraid it's going to make me look bad.
Okay, great. So you see, your opinion, your emotion is actually a reflection of your thinking. We often get the cart before the horse, but when we look at our emotion and ask these questions, like why, what is the anger about? Because something's not fair, because something's not someone she's not doing what she should be doing, right? So that leads us into the questions. When we can just say, okay, I accept the emotion, I'm angry, but let me take that apart a little bit, right? So what in this situation, what do you want? What would you like to have happen? Let's suppose you want to have a conversation, you want to solve this problem. What would you like to have happen?
I'd like that person to commit to an outcome and stick with it. And that means don't commit if you
Okay.
can't stick with it, but commit to an outcome and stick with it, like a deadline.
Okay. Okay. Right. And have you ever had that conversation with her?
This is all hypothetical. The answer is no for the purposes of this
Okay.
hypothetical conversation here.
Yeah, okay. Okay. But okay, so we now know that your desire is actually an honorable thing. There's nothing wrong with wanting people to make commitments they can keep. That's the commitment conversation, which builds trust. So there's nothing wrong with that. So that is a piece of gold that we just found that you can bring into a conversation with her or with the boss, and not be spreading rumors, but saying, here's what I really would like to have happen. So sometimes these toxic things or internal to our internal dialogue, when we really look at them, they're not so toxic at all. We can go, this is all I want. I'd like to talk to you about that. So you can you can turn it into a productive conversation.
Right. Okay. So I
So
can
what are your
imagine.
concerns?
So my concerns are that she's about to, or he is about to do it again. That they're not going to follow through on their commitment. And one more time, I'm going to be left holding the ball at the 99th hour and rushing and stressing. And I don't want to do that. There's my concerns.
Okay. Okay. All right. And again, and that fuels your anger.
Yeah.
That you have to do it again and again because tomorrow is going to look a lot like today, right? Totally legitimate. The question there is, depending on what conversation you decide to have with whom, you can decide whether you want to surface that or not.
All right.
But again, it's not as toxic as it sounds once we say it out loud and say, I have plenty of work myself. I don't want to have to redo someone else's work, or I'd like help in figuring out how to solve this problem, right? So there's again a little turn there where we can make it productive, right?
Right. Right. Okay. And
Okay,
now we
so
come to a
authority.
power issue. Yeah. Okay. How does
Mhm.
this one come into play now?
Okay, so we're in a hierarchy, right? We're in a business, right? So what? So where are you? Are you colleagues? Are you equals? Are you a director? Is he a
Peers.
manager? Where are we? Okay,
Peers, but I think it gets dicey because, yeah, I don't know if my peer is closer to the boss or not, or am I closer to the boss? Like there's that competitive dynamic that often exists in
that's
these
right.
scenarios. So,
That's
who
right.
has more
Yeah.
power?
Yeah. So who knows? So that is that when I said it's really important to be aware of those things, the more you can sort of the more you can tune in to and like maybe if we weren't role playing, you would say, I was just swatting a fly away. You you could role play, and we could say, well, um, do you really have a sense of how the boss treats you versus how the boss treats him or her? Is there a difference there? Is there a power dynamic playing out that would help you be aware of? Because it might be that there's a conversation to have with your boss about that or about this, right? If you felt like it was safe. So often the risk we take or willing to take in a conversation has a lot to do with the power dynamics.
The power.
Um,
Yeah, and how much I'm going to say and how I'm going to say it and the words that I'm going to use. Okay. All right. Fair enough. So I make a conscious choice. I'm aware of the power dynamics. I'm aware that I believe the boss is closer to my peer than they are to me. I see them going out for lunch regularly, and I don't go out for lunch with the boss. So it feels like there's a personal relationship. Now, I will just flag for everybody listening that as a coach, I have seen that happen because the boss is trying to coach the peer to do a better job. It's not because they're actually closer. You don't know the
there,
reasons, but we often jump to conclusions. Again, another
that's
story we're
right.
telling
That's right.
ourselves. Okay.
That's right.
All right.
Yeah, and if that came up, you then that's a conversation you could have with the boss. I just want to ask you about my relationship with Bob or Mindy, whomever it is, right? Because I have some concerns. I want to do a great job. I want them to do their work, but I have concerns about my ability to work with her and talk to her about this. Are you what's your take on how she's performing or he's performing? And that would be a safe conversation to have.
Mhm.
Yeah,
With some bosses.
scary but safe.
So, yeah, scary,
Yes,
but
with some bosses. Yes,
okay.
yeah. It depends on the risk and how safe you feel. Yeah.
All right. So, how do the standards now come into this?
Okay, now this is a good one here because now you say, okay, so your concerns are about not wanting to do extra work, not wanting to redo someone else's work, right?
Right. And
So
not
you
being
have a
rushed. Yeah.
and not being rushed. You have a very strong ethic of doing good work on time, right? Right? Not everybody shares that. Not everybody has that experience. Not everybody can even do that. They're not even competent to do it. So it might be a matter of competence on their part that they're like doing a job they aren't competent to do. It might be a matter of reliability. They can do the job, but they really have a bad pattern around timing. And it might be insincerity. It might be that they're saying one thing, but they're doing another. Right.
It could also be competing priorities. So, what I don't know is what else is on their plate and how that became a fire or an urgency and delayed work.
That's right. So the idea here is that instead of going, if we're all ball up in our anger, right, and you say, I can't just go to him or her and say, you know what, I'm really angry. I'm tired of doing your work. I'm tired of not hitting deadlines with you. We're going to have a bad conversation. I mean, it's going to go nowhere. But you can take any four of these, any one of these four, and say, let me redesign how that conversation might look. And so I might say, let me have a conversation with my colleague about our standards, like my concerns about our work together and how they think about it and what they're seeing. They could be totally blind to not doing it on time because no one has talked to them. No one has given them the feedback. They could be blind to their incompetence, that their work isn't up to snuff. So you could approach it as, can we talk about our work together? Because I have some very high standards that look like this, and I'm curious about how you think about it and how you think about our how our work is going.
Okay. All
Um,
right. So I think what's interesting about your four questions is it forces me to get out of my judgment mindset and into a legitimate business concern. It's what I often call about I get clean. I'm going to use clean my language so it's not offensive, it's not an attack, it's not a general statement like I don't trust you, colleague. Okay, so that is not going to go very far. If I say that, we're going to have a bad conversation. But I'm getting into, I'm frustrated by having to rush at the last minute when your work comes over to me. That's a legitimate concern. And we can say,
That's a legitimate concern
right,
based on your standard, right?
right. And then I want to explore what's going on with you, why that might be happening, and ultimately hope to get to a place where we can have a resolution.
Right. And that when you open your hand and say, here's my concerns, here are my standards, I'm curious about yours, right? That is the heart of the collaborative conversation. That ability to open your hand and heart and say, hey, here's what I'm feeling and thinking. It invites other people to do that. Some people respond, some people don't respond, but at least you're clean,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yes, that's right.
Right. And then, if you do that, if that's done well, then you could say, so how might creative conversation, how might we do this differently tomorrow?
Okay.
What are small things, commitment conversations that we could agree to make this feel different a week from now
Okay.
and hold each other accountable?
Okay. All right. So I get that they flow one to the other, but if I don't stop to think about the story that I'm telling myself about me and about the other person and about the work for that matter, the manager for that
Hmm.
matter too,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not then prepared to have the next conversation, which is the collaborative conversation. What's going on for you? Or the creative conversation, what else could we do? Or the commitment conversation, can I commit to this and can you commit to that? Okay.
That's right. That's
All
right.
right.
Yeah. And if you don't do your work, you're still going to, even if you want to have a conversation, you're still going to go with a closed fist.
Right. Got to do that one. Okay. So the collaborative conversations. All right. Every business I deal with everywhere in the universe wants more collaboration. I worry that they don't know what that means they want. And I am certain that they're unprepared to create the time it takes to build collaborative work, let alone collaborative conversations. So, what's your advice on what goes wrong in collaborative conversations?
Well, I think if we've all had plenty of experience in meetings that don't go well, it's a bunch of fists sitting around the table going, no, this, no, this. And the other problem is that different people in the room are in different conversations. So one person might be telling their story. We tried to do this 10 years ago. It didn't work. It's going to be a waste of our time. Another person is saying, well, maybe there's some ideas to explore, looking for perspectives. Another person saying, or we're creative, new ideas. Another person saying, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Action conversation. So we're like swimming in these, but not focused. So my best advice is, yes, collaborative conversations mean you have to do your work. So you come with an open hand and an open heart. That's imperative, and you have to teach people to do that. But then I'd say you have to purposefully make time for collaborative and creative conversations. So when we love storytelling and we love the commitment conversation, the action conversation, but we miss the middle too. I call that the conversational bypass, right? So to avoid the bypass, which is like, okay, we hear a bunch of stories around the table, and then someone says, or the boss says, what are we going to do? And we go, we're going to do this. Boom, and it's done, right? We miss that whole learning process, that whole creative, what else is possible? Are there other ideas we should consider to vet decisions, right? We miss that. So instead of the conversational bypass, okay, let's take 10 minutes, go around and say, how many perspectives are there in this room? And what do we need to learn from each other? What do we need to open our eyes, open our minds to go, oh, I never thought of it that way, Wanda. Yeah, that's interesting. That makes me think differently, right? Take time to do that and say, okay, before we jump to the action, let's take 10 minutes and say, what else is possible? What are things we might be missing about our decision that would shift our final action? So it's not rocket science, but you have to just do that purposefully and
Yeah.
consciously.
If I think back on every example I know that I have seen where a major social change or company change or cultural change happened, it was an intentional choice to bring people together with very different perspectives and to force them to tell their stories in a very structured way. So it is on the table. And then to force a collaborative conversation where we actually hear everybody's perspective on the problem. And it's when you get through those and you take the time for it. Most people won't take the time because it feels slow, because we've not moved to action yet. It feels so. But when you do the time for that, the rest of it seems, in my experience, to move pretty quickly. The creative can move and the commitment can move. That's your experience as well.
Yeah, yeah. And the people that say to me, I don't have time, my question to them is, so how many decisions you've made that you had to revisit?
Yeah.
A week later, you go, oh, we didn't have all the information. Or 2 weeks later, you go, oh my gosh, the world is changing and we have to shift gears. So, and I honestly, I don't believe it's a day. You don't have to go off and do an offsite. 15 minutes. Let's chew on this together. Let's
Right.
get smart together instead of
Right.
getting dumb
Right.
together.
That's right. I often say to people, you can spend your time getting everybody to weigh in and have an opinion and understand those opinions, or you can spend your time chasing that they do what you ask them to do at the at the beginning, any rate. So pick your poison, which one you want to do.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay. All right. You have an exercise in the book I love. It's called the left hand column exercise. Tell us about that and why that matters.
Okay. That um, that is a really powerful exercise, and I've done it with hundreds of people. In the language world that I studied in, it's called private and public conversations. And my theory is that the bigger the gap between what's going on with the committee or the monkeys in our mind and what we're saying out loud, the more stress we live in. And so the exercise is a forced function, and writing this stuff down is really crucial. I mean, it really makes a difference in how your neurons fire and your ability to think clearly, right? So the exercise on the right hand side of a piece of paper, you write a conversation, maybe 3 or 5 exchanges. I said, she said, I said, she said. You write exactly what was said as though it were videotaped. Um, so it's just for verbatim. And then you go back, and on the other side of the paper, for every time I talk or you talk or the other person talks, you write what you were thinking and feeling. And so let's say, for example, I said, what do you think about our progress? She said, it's too soon to tell. Then I said, well, we should probably consider where we are uh, with timing, with our budget. And she says, oh, I think we're fine. And then I say, well, maybe we should talk to Jim, our boss. That was the conversation. I go back, I go on the left hand side and I write, I said, what do you think about the project? And I'm thinking, we are in so much damn trouble. We're never going to hit our damn budget or our timing or our goal, right? She says it's too soon to tell. What I'm thinking and feeling is she doesn't have a damn clue about what's going on, right? That's a huge gap, right? And that's a uh, real thing that happens daily basis with people in their conversations at work. So, first of all, you have to have the courage to do the exercise. And then when I do it with people, my first question is, okay, what would happen? I ask them what was in the left hand column,
Mhm.
and what would you guess would be there?
Some pretty heavy judgments, all sorts of
Yeah,
things. Yeah.
negatives, a lot of curse words.
Yeah.
It's all there, right? Okay. So then I say, so what would you do? What would happen if you just said that out loud? They say, well, and a career limiting move, or ruin a relationship, or and say, so what happens if you don't say it out loud? I'm stressing inside. I'm boiling inside, and it's not healthy for me. It's psychologically, emotionally, physically, it's not healthy. So what do we do? So we have to take those negative judgments and we process them. And guess what we use? We use the 4 questions.
Questions. So we're back to the storytelling. Yep.
Yeah. And we take a negative thing. She doesn't have a goddamn clue what she's talking about. And I process that. And I'll guarantee you, you'll come for one of the negative things and the 4 questions, you'll come out with some golden nuggets that help you to reduce the gap and to entertain a different conversation and design a different conversation from what you learned from doing the exercise.
Right. I mean, I can imagine taking that example, doesn't have the person doesn't have a clue how urgent this problem is or whatever else I want to say about it, and say, okay, so now what's the story I'm telling myself and what's my goal in this one? And so I can imagine running through those four questions and coming up with some pretty strong insights. Like, I have a concern that we're off track on hitting our forecast. And I have a concern that not the whole team is not as attuned to that gap as I believe they need to be. And I actually have some standards about being ahead of the curve as opposed to being behind the curve, being transparent about our budget, and at a minimum, being able to tell our boss where we are if we have to. Uh, okay. Now that's a conversation I can say out loud. I might not say, you're an idiot, you don't know what you're doing, but
Yes, because you will avoid that conversation. You don't want to have that conversation. It's too scary. The only thing I would add is, because you did a beautiful job. The only thing I would add is maybe start with, I have some data that has me thinking concerned about our budget and our timing.
okay.
That's starting with the facts,
Okay.
And when I look at the facts, it gives me angst. So I want to talk to you about that. And that's sort of setting a context, giving a little bit of a foundation with data to ground the conversation.
Right. Right.
Right.
Well, I also find too, we ask questions of somebody else, hoping they'll say the thing that is actually in our mind that we don't want to say because it's scary to say. Like, it's easier to say, if I was giving you working with you, Chuck, and I was going to say, you've blown the budget, Chuck, what are you doing? Rather than say that, I might say, oh, Chuck, how do you think the budget is going? Well, if you're not
Right.
aware that you've blown the budget, we've lost the conversational thread.
Yeah.
It's
It's
gone.
going nowhere.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Right.
We'll have continue to have a conversation. We'll both have a private conversation that isn't pretty.
Right. Right.
Because when we're doing our exercise about the private conversation, I guarantee you that the other person has their private
Oh, yeah.
conversation about what a pain in the neck you are.
Yeah. But if I start this with a courage to say, Chuck, I'm worried about the budget.
Right.
I didn't accuse you. I didn't attack you. I didn't put you on the defensive. I just said, hey, I'm worried about it. Let's have a
Yes.
conversation
Right.
about it. Is a much easier
Yeah.
place to begin than a
That's
fake
right.
question that I then got to recover from. All right. We talked about the conversational bypass and this tendency to jump from the little bit of the storytelling, what we think, what we're all our concerns are, straight to what do we do about it? Bypass the collaboration, bypass the creative. So we end up with limited options on the tables. What's your advice to fix that? Just go back and do the 10 minutes for the collaborative, 10 minutes for the creative? Anything else we should do?
Well, I'm thinking about writing another book on meetings,
Okay. Well, hey, we need it.
because yeah, it's a little deeper. I mean, yes, I think if you can do that, it's great. But there's a deeper cultural issue that plays out. What has to do with authority and power, right? We, there's a subject that we have to resolve. Somehow the email gets sent out. You just sort of invite the people you think are connected, right? And we end up with 20 people in a meeting. Um, but in fact, they're probably not the right 20 people to solve the problem, right? But that's a cultural issue of, like, I've worked with teams say, like, disinvite these people or start the meeting, do information sharing, and then people leave and they say, okay, from now, for the real collaborative conversation, let's make sure we have the right people, the right experts in the room, right? So there's a cultural thing there about meetings that have to do with being included, not being excluded, power, who has authority, who's loved, who's not loved. Um, so that's a big piece to play into this. But I think any leader could, if they do their work, they could start by saying, let's just take the extra 10 minutes and do this. Right. Now, eventually, they're gonna see if there's cultural things playing out where people, they don't have the right people in the room, and then they need some skills to say, how do we change that? Because there's only three things that happens in meetings. There's information sharing, which is a lot of people. There's information processing, which is collaboration and creativity, which is less people, the right people. And then there's decision making, which is less people and the right people, right?
I love that. Information sharing, collaboration and creativity, and decision making. I think you're right about that. And each needs to be structured differently. And who needs to be in those meetings is different for each one of them. But you can't bypass one to the other without going through the middle of the process.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right.
And I love that there's an Aristotle quote. It's easy to be angry in the right way about the right thing at the right time with the right person is difficult. And so I say it's easy to have a meeting, but to have a meeting with the right people in the right way about the right thing at the right time is difficult.
They're difficult. Absolutely. We could certainly use some help. I think we mix up too often, speaking of meetings, whether the meeting is information sharing or the meeting is actually a resolution of something. So we're looking for that creative collaborative, and we shouldn't mix them up. All right, Chuck, what a great conversation. My summary coming out of this: 4 kinds of conversations: storytelling conversation, collaborative conversation, what's your opinion, your view; creative conversation, what are the possibilities; and commitment conversation, what could we do. They have to go one to the next. They can't jump around. We can't get to commitment without collaboration and creative, at least not good commitment. And there are 4, actually 5 essential questions I have to ask myself in order to start the process. 5, because what's the data that I have or the facts that I have? 1, what's my goal or outcome? What am I looking to achieve here? 3, what are my concerns? Really, truly, what are my concerns? 4, I'm going to lose the 4. What are the power issues that are at play? And 5, what are my values, standards, opinions, judgments that are here? I take those 4 plus the facts, and I look back and say, now, out of all of that, what do I want to talk about with my counterparty? Where's the
Right.
conversation I need to have?
How can I design a productive conversation?
And
Right.
then how do I listen to their counter story in exactly the same way? But that moves us into collaboration.
Yeah, yeah. And it's really like if we open our hand and we ask questions, we're inviting people to open their hand, and that's sort of like that's the magic of the questions.
All
Yeah.
right. My
Yeah.
guest today, Chuck Wisner. The book is The Art of Conscious Conversations, Transforming How We Talk, Listen, and Interact. What a great conversation, Chuck. And I assume that if people want to reach out to you, they could just go to your website, chuckwisner.com, and find some link there, or find you on LinkedIn, I guess, also.
Yeah, they'll find me. Yeah.
All right.
I'm around,
Good.
but happy to if they have a question or have them reach out via my website.
Great. Fantastic. And we certainly love to hear from you. If you're listening today, outofthecomfortzone.com, just shoot us an email. Love to hear from you. Like us on your favorite podcast server. Please send us any notes or what you'd like to see, and certainly join us next week for another episode in Getting Out of Your Comfort Zone.